Russian attacks on the Azov steel plant in Mariupol continue as Ukrainian fighters try to hold out. And some civilians who were trapped for weeks have been evacuated. What's next in this deadly conflict? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. The fighting in Ukraine rages on with no immediate prospect of peace. Meanwhile, Moscow is preparing for Victory Day on Monday. The annual event celebrates the Soviet Union's defeat of Nazism in the Second World War. We begin with this report from correspondent Sergio Olmos in Kyiv.
I'm here in the capital, Kyiv, Ukraine, where we're hearing that at least 25 civilians have been bussed out of Mariupol, an effort by the United Nations in their third humanitarian corridor. A total of over 500 civilians now have been safely evacuated from Mariupol and taken to Zaporizhzhia, where they're receiving treatment. Conditions in the steel plant in Mariupol, where the last Ukrainian defenders and civilians are holding out, are dire. Unsanitary conditions, poor medical supplies and nutrition. But at least 500 now have been evacuated. We know that the steel plant continues to be under attack by the Russian armed forces, and we heard President Zelensky describe this as a torture. He described the bombing of Mariupol and the devastation there as a kind of terrorism intended to scare civilians nationwide. We saw explosions in Lviv a few nights ago. We're seeing in Donetsk a couple days ago a missile attack that killed 10 and injured more than 20. Heading into May 9th on Monday, the mayor of Kyiv issued a warning for citizens not to gather in groups, fearing that there could be more attacks in the capital this weekend.
Well, to discuss all of this, joining me now from Kyiv is Peter Zalmayev. He is director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Also with us from Moscow is Pavel Felgenhauer. He is a defense analyst and columnist for the independent Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta. Joining us too from Washington, D.C. is Klaus Larres. He is a German and European affairs commentator and a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And from Providence, Rhode Island, also joining the discussion is Vladimir Golstein. He is chair of Slavic Studies at Brown University. Welcome to all of you. Peter, let me start with you, and let's just look again at what our reporter just told us about the situation at the Azov steel plant. Fighting is still continuing there. There were reports that at least 25 civilians were released from the area today. The Russian army continues to target Mariupol. What is your assessment of what is happening right there, right now, and why do you think Mariupol is being targeted by the Russians?
Well, indeed, the Russians have been desperate to, knock out the remaining bit of the resistance in the city, firing untold numbers of artillery rounds and sparing no effort to do that. It doesn't really hold much, strategic value anymore for the Russians, but rather symbolic value. They are controlling the entirety of the city with the exception of this plant. So it has both the significance for Ukraine as, an example of a heroic resistance for 73 days now. But for the Russians, it's even more important because, the Victory Day, which is May 9th, the day of the victory over the Nazi Germany is coming up. That's when the military parade takes place in the Red Square in Moscow. Vladimir Putin is going to want to, present the full, control of the city and the Azov steel plant as a victory to celebrate. So far, that victory is incomplete. Elsewhere, Russia is controlling the south, such as Kherson. It's not having much progress in the area of Izum and Kharkiv. In fact, the Ukrainian forces have been reported to have staged successful counterattacks and recaptured some villages and towns. And so, the fact is that the entire power structure in Russia is built on the wishes and whims of one man, and the generals, no matter what the military expedience is, of the orders. They are doing everything else to fulfill the political orders of this one man.
Pavel Felgenhauer, on Monday, of course, as we've been discussing, Russia will commemorate Victory Day. That marks the victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. What can we expect from the Kremlin on Monday?
Well, it's a very important event, maybe the most important event of the year for the Kremlin and President Vladimir Putin. There's going to be a grand military parade in Moscow and actually in all kind of more or less significant Russian cities and in the garrisons of the Russian military all over the country. There will be a speech. People are expecting that maybe there will be some political announcements at the Red Square, or later on there's going to be a reception for the military and veterans in the Kremlin. So Putin will have the opportunity to make some kind of political statements, which may or may not be very important. There was expressed opinions in the West that Moscow tried to wrap up the entire Ukrainian campaign, the so-called special operations, by V-Day on May 9th. I don't think that's happening. It's clearly not happening. But still, it's very important as a rallying point for the government, for the Kremlin, and it's going to be kind of, it always has been a kind of a very important event with a lot of kind of jingoistic overtones to it. And it's, of course, also important because we are right now told there was a very cold and wet spring in Russia and Ukraine, moving into the summer period, the summer campaign, and Russia most likely is preparing for, the Russian military preparing serious action that may, in their opinion, change the entire course of this campaign. So there's going to be a lot of pending action. It's highly symbolic, and it's also really important for the Russians and for the Ukrainians, for everyone else, I believe.
So, Pavel, are you saying that then you expect the conflict to escalate in the months ahead, in the summer months ahead?
I believe that's a very high possibility. Russian military still have the initiative, and there are indications pointing to that they have gathered serious reserves right now. They are apparently moving forces away, say, from Kharkiv, where the Ukrainians really have successes in pushing forward. That means there's not much troops left there. Well, there somewhere these troops will reappear. As I say, as the summer comes up, the ground becomes dry, especially in the south, in the open steppes of the north of the Black Sea and the Azov Sea. And I believe that the Russian generals, who are all basically tank generals in charge of the Russian entire military, not only the army, but the entire military, would want to go on an offensive, break out into the open, instead of trench warfare, to have maneuverable warfare where Russia can utilize its advantage in firepower, in armor, and in air power, maneuvering out the Ukrainians and maybe scoring a decisive victory. So I believe in the second half of May and in June, it's going to be a lot of action.
Klaus Larres, what are your thoughts on this? Do you expect the conflict to escalate, or do you think the Kremlin, given the status of the conflict right now on the ground, the Kremlin might just consolidate what it's holding right now?
Well, it looks as if the Russians are trying to escalate the conflict. At the moment, we see a kind of warfare like we saw during the First World War, trench warfare, but with the Russians being very assertive, trying to push forward, trying to push the Ukrainians back. There have also been bombing attacks on various cities and towns all over Ukraine to intimidate the population, to target civilians targets. That all indicates that the Russians have not given up by any means, that they are dead set on occupying and conquering and occupying the wider Donbas area, and perhaps still dream of going beyond that. That is, of course, what we don't know. Perhaps Putin, when he will talk on May 9, will clarify what his objectives actually are, but we will find out. And then, of course, Putin hopes that he will still be able to divide the European Union, that he can divide the transatlantic alliance, because at the moment the heavy weapons deliveries from the West to Ukraine, that is what makes the Russian life very, very difficult. Ukraine by itself is, of course, not strong enough to really resist a heavy Russian onslaught. It needs Western weapons, and it is getting these weapons, and I think that is what the Russians want to prevent. And if the transatlantic alliance was split up and divided, that would be much more difficult. And I think that is one of his goals as well, to really weaken the NATO and Western alliance.
Vladimir Golstein, as Klaus just told us, we possibly may get some kind of clarification from the Kremlin on Monday, on May 9th, on Victory Day, on what the objectives of President Putin are. What are the objectives? I mean, at the outset of this conflict, the president in Russia said that he was going to, he wanted Ukraine to be demilitarized, he wanted to denazify Ukraine, as he put it, and he also wanted Ukraine to be neutral. I mean, let's take one of those things, denazification. Has that been achieved?
Well, it doesn't look like it has been achieved, but I think this is on some levels. He posited his goals, and then probably was hoping to modify as he goes along. So far, his campaign wasn't particularly successful. Russians are moving ahead, but not as fast as I imagine they wanted to. But what's have to be stressed is that they are capable of escalating. They're capable of raising the stakes and moving faster and hitting stronger. So I don't think he's kind of, I imagine that by denazification, he doesn't mean like hunting some people with Nazi tattoos. This is not kind of a very serious proposition. But what he wants to do is to make sure that, the cities are run and the country is run by the people who are not openly belligerent to the Russian language, Russian culture, who are probably kind of neutral in that sense. We had countries who were just, dealing, with the West, with Russia, and doing it rather successfully. So I think that's his goal. Whether he will accomplish or not, it remains to be seen. What Klaus said, that Russia's goal is to weaken European alliance, but we've heard both from European alliance and from United States very clear goals to weaken Russia. So if this talk continues, this desire to weaken each other can lead actually to tremendous escalation. So there should be some kind of a settlement which will satisfy Russia and satisfy, Ukraine. But talking just about the goals while ignoring, endless amount of lives being wasted, it's a little bit kind of, I think, myopic. And so far, what West presents, Putin refusing to sit at the table of diplomacy and negotiations. But I think we also see that the West refuses to sit down, because this talk about our goal is to weaken Russia so they wouldn't be able to do anything like that in the future. This is actually an invitation to escalation.
Peter, one of the goals that President Putin talked about was to demilitarize Ukraine, but that seems to have backfired. I mean, if we look at the number of weapons, sophisticated weapons, that is going into Ukraine right now, it seems that that goal has failed, hasn't it?
Well, indeed, a lot of what Vladimir Putin has done has been a self-fulfilling prophecy. What the previous speaker said about, Vladimir Putin wishing to, control Ukraine or some at least population centers where there would be respect of the Russian language. Well, first, I reject that, thesis, simply because what we're seeing is a colonial war with Vladimir Putin. He is using all this rhetoric of denazification to really as a cloak of his real intention. That is an old-school colonial-style war of conquest. All he wants Ukrainian territory, and he doesn't even care about the so-called population centers. If he, controls Mariupol, completely depopulated and destroyed, that's fine by him. He's not going to spend money probably rebuilding it. He just wants territory on the map. A very old school kind of thinking. And like what you said regarding his process of demilitarization. Obviously, Ukraine has gotten a lot of new weaponry. In fact, what he achieved for Ukraine is a major revolutionary change in its military doctrine, simply because it's being switched to a much more sophisticated NATO standard, weaponry. And when it comes to his main thesis, why he went into Ukraine is to prevent NATO expansion, including to cover Ukraine or Georgia, for example. He's achieved the opposite. Obviously, Georgia and Ukraine want NATO more than ever, and two more countries are now about to join. The heretofore neutral Finland and Sweden.
Yeah.
I think it's a matter of days before they join.
Okay, Vladimir Golstein, what do you make of that? I mean, this talk of denazification, for instance, is that just a ploy, as we just heard, that obscures the real intentions of Russia, which is to get more land?
No, this is really absurd. Russia has more land than any other country. It actually has so much land in Siberia, which is just empty there. So just to imagine, this is like a Ukraino-centric view or Polish-centric view, the paranoia, which is kind of was created by 16th, 17th, or 18th century division of the country. That was a different politics, different situations. As if we look at the map, Russia, Soviet Union, used to be to the borders of Germany. Then they withdraw from there. They withdraw from Germany. They withdraw from Baltic. They withdraw from everywhere. While they were withdrawing, NATO is moving in. This is a reality. People can look at the map and see it. And to hear this rather absurd statements about Russia wanted the land, just look where NATO bases are. So who wants the land? Who's going to believe this charges? And what Putin wants to do is precisely to have a neutral country which wouldn't be inviting NATO. But if not, NATO is going to invite itself, then we're going to face escalation and we're going to end up with a third world war. So just that type of talk, it doesn't lead anywhere, really.
Klaus Larres, what are your thoughts on what you've just heard?
Well, when one listens to the previous speaker, then one wonders why actually did Russia invade if it didn't want to conquer Ukraine? And of course it was a Russian aggressive invasion of a foreign country, and that is not acceptable. And of course that means conquest. So Russia wants to conquer Ukraine. Also what one of the other speakers said about that the West wants to weaken Russia. That would not have happened if Russia had not invaded Ukraine. No one talked about weakening Russia before the 24th of February when Russia invaded Ukraine. The same with denazification. That is, of course, pure propaganda. Putin tries to link the Second World War, the fight against Hitler, with his current war against Ukraine. There are very few Nazis in Ukraine, and definitely the leadership and Zelensky and his administration is not full of Nazis. There are no Nazis whatsoever. There are some Nazis among the soldiers of Ukraine, the Azov battalion above all, but that is a tiny minority of the soldiers fighting for Ukraine. And the administration, the country, is not a country full of Nazis, but Putin tries to draw the link between Hitler, Germany, many years ago, and current Ukraine. And this is pure propaganda, and there's no reality to that. It has really no factual reality whatsoever. And I think we should all realize that.
Pavel Felgenhauer, is this an attempt by Russia at a land grab? Because as Klaus Larres pointed out a moment ago, why else would it have invaded Ukraine?
Well, it's obviously Russia wants control over Ukraine to be sure that there would be no threats coming from Ukrainian territory and that there would be a kind of Russia-friendly government there. So it's surely for control. And I believe that this is still very much the goal of the Russian policy and military policy, because right now, as obvious even from this discussion, it's clear that the positions of the opposing parties are miles apart. There doesn't seem to be any kind of easy achievable or obvious compromise seen there. And that means there's going to be much more fighting to change the situation by other means than negotiations, if negotiations are bogged down, as everyone says they are bogged down. And so that's what's going to happen, because a continued war of attrition, as right now it's kind of figuring out, is not a war that Russia could ever win against the United West, backing up Ukraine militarily and financially.
Okay, Pavel, there has been one proposal which has come from the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky. He says, look, he's prepared to look at a peace settlement as long as Russia moves back, Russian troops that is, moves back to the positions that they had before February 24th. Is that a starting point?
Well, even apparently that is not so. The Ukrainians say that they may agree to postpone the problem of Crimea for at least 15 years to slowly kind of find a kind of solution that would be acceptable to all. But they say they don't want the Russian or pro-Russian forces keeping that part of Donbass that they kept before February 24. Even there's not agreement. And of course, the Russian position is that they should recognize without immediately that Crimea is Russian, recognize the independence of the Donbass republics. So I say the positions of the two sides right now are miles apart. That there seems to be no room right now for much compromise. There's a lot and lots of room for fighting.
Peter, on the question of a negotiated settlement, does President Zelensky have full autonomy over entering into some kind of agreement, or are there factions, powerful factions within Ukraine that may not accept any kind of settlement, would not want to give an inch?
Well, that faction is probably the Ukrainian people and the soldiers who are fighting and dying. You know, if in the early days, if you remember those early rounds of talks, there was some kind of thought given to, you know, what territorial concessions Ukraine may be willing to, you know, consider to establish a new status quo. You know, it is inconceivable right now that this would happen. Also, because for a variety of reasons, obviously, you know, Ukrainians are being, you know, given a certain amount of information, and probably, you know, some information is being withheld. You know, in the minds of Ukrainians, Ukraine is having successes in the, you know, in the battlefields. You know, obviously there was a very, you know, resonant sinking of the Moskva battleship. So Ukrainians are feeling that they have the momentum, especially now that the West has decided to give Ukrainians all the weapons that it needs. So in a way, President Zelensky is, you know, finding himself boxed into a corner, and if there's talk of a negotiation, it's going to be a very, very tight spot for him, you know, as far as any territorial concessions, especially.
Yeah, Peter, the reason I asked that question is because there have been reports, lots of reports, and we've heard from President Zelensky himself saying that he is prepared to announce a neutral Ukraine, a Ukraine that would not join or seek membership of NATO, but that there were factions within the country that said, you can't do that, it's not happening.
Well, neutral status is something that's probably, you know, it's probably doable, but the question is, can Ukraine, you know, claim to be neutral and still aspire to be a member of NATO? That is obviously kind of an oxymoron. But we're also hearing from President of the United States, Joe Biden. He has broached the subject of neutrality one way or another. I think it's something that will have to be considered. But the big question right now, the sticking point is, in the absence of NATO, what security guarantees can Ukraine get? Who will be these guarantors? So far, the people who have been, the countries have been approached, including the U.S., Britain, France, they're not easy about being thrust into a position where they would ad hoc guarantee Ukraine's security in case of Russia's further hostilities.
Right. Klaus Larres, there's been one other development. U.S. media have been reporting that the Pentagon has been providing intelligence to Ukraine, which enabled them to kill Russian generals as well as to sink the Russian battleship in the Black Sea. Now, the Pentagon has subsequently denied those reports, but it was a very nuanced denial. They said they are providing intelligence, but not specifically for the reasons that the media was saying was done. I mean, how dangerous is this? I mean, could Russia see the United States, if it is providing this kind of intelligence, as a co-combatant in this conflict?
The United States has clearly provided intelligence to Ukraine, and this intelligence has been proven to be highly effective.
Yeah.
Whether the United States intended the Ukrainians to kill 12 high-ranking generals, that's a different question, but it certainly contributed to that. It depends a little how Putin is going to interpret that, and it could well lead to an escalation of the war. On the other hand, what is the United States supposed to do? Because we all know without American intelligence and Western heavy weaponry, Ukraine would stand no chance to defend itself against the invader. So, of course, the Western world helps Ukraine as much as they can in order to defend themselves. And it's a war of defense for Ukraine. It's not an aggressive war. And I think it's difficult to blame the United States to provide everything in their force to Ukraine, except troops and except air power support.
Vladimir Golstein, how will Russia be looking at this?
Well, Russia is actually, it's very important. Peter, at the very beginning of the show, said that this is the war of Putin. This is not the case. What the Russians are seeing is the united West against them, with the United States providing information. Sanctions are just multiplying from every direction. So that's how Russia perceives it. So Russia is getting, in fact, much more resolved in solving the issue. One way or another. And the issue for Russia is very different from what, for example, speakers today present. This is not Russia's invasion or war against Ukraine. This is gradual and slow encroachment of NATO. As recently as just 2 days ago, Pope, very important figure, said that NATO is barking at Russian doors. If you look at all the major diplomats, major architects of post-war politics, they were all warning against expanding NATO.
Vladimir, okay, let me just stop you there for a moment. How does going into Ukraine solve that problem?
Well, I think it solves very simply, because if NATO bases will be in Ukraine, that basically means an absolutely existential threat to Russia. Because, if they say nuclear arms are flying from France, Russia have time to answer back, because the whole architecture was built on mutual deterrence. Yeah. If the weapons are standing in Kiev or even in Kharkov, which is 50 miles from Russia, then Russia cannot answer anything. So this is existential threat, and we know countries like Israel.
Right, but how does the fact that Russian troops in Ukraine solve it? I still don't get that.
I think that was the idea of Putin, to create the country which would say we're going to be neutral without NATO, and that gives Russia necessarily few minutes of nuclear arms flying. That was his goal, and I'm sure his generals tell him exactly that.
Yeah. Okay, and that's where we are going to have to leave it. Time has caught up with us. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching, and have a great weekend.